My hands didn't shake when I saw them on the security monitor. That surprised me. After 19 years of wondering what this moment would feel like, I expected my chest to cave in, my breath to catch something. But I just stood there in my Austin penthouse, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold, watching two people who used to be my entire world stand at my front door, like salespeople who hadn't learned the meaning of the word no. My mother was wearing her good coat, the navy one she only brought out for church and funerals. My father had his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, the way he always did when he was trying to look approachable. They looked older, smaller, like the house I grew up in. After you move away, you go back once and realize it was never as big as you remembered. My father leaned toward the intercom, and I heard his voice crackle through the speaker. "Sweetheart, we know you're home. We just need 5 minutes. We just need you to sign the paper." I set my coffee down on the marble counter, very slowly, very deliberately. I had been waiting 19 years for this conversation, and I had spent the last 4 months making sure I was ready for it. Before I tell you what happened when I opened that door, I need you to understand where I came from. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from right now. I want to know who's with me tonight. Nashville, Tennessee. 19 years ago. My name is Claire Ashford. I was 22 years old, 1 semester away from finishing my accounting degree at Vanderbilt, and I was in love with a man named Daniel, who fixed motorcycles for a living and made me laugh harder than anyone I had ever met. He was kind and steady and patient, and he had a laugh that filled every room he walked into. He was also the son of a mechanic from East Nashville, which, according to my father, made him the single greatest threat to the Ashford family name since the last recession. My father, Richard, had built Ashford Financial Consulting from nothing. He was proud of that, rightfully so, I always thought. But somewhere along the way, the pride curdled into something harder. The kind of pride that looks at a good man and sees only a zip code. He had a vision for my future that involved a corner office, a husband with an MBA, and a last name that carried weight at charity galas. Daniel didn't fit the blueprint. And blueprints, to my father, were sacred. My mother, Diane, never disagreed with my father. Not once. Not about anything that mattered. She had a talent for being in the room while being entirely absent from it. I had been dating Daniel for 2 years when I told them I wanted to marry him. I chose a Sunday dinner because I thought the formality of the table might soften things. I thought wrong. My father put down his fork. He didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice. That was somehow worse. He looked at me with the particular disappointment of a man who has decided you are a problem to be managed, rather than a person to be loved. He said that if I walked out of his house to be with Daniel, I should not expect to walk back in. He said he had invested too much in my future to watch me throw it away on sentiment. He called my relationship with Daniel a character flaw I needed to outgrow. My mother folded her napkin. She looked at the window. She said nothing. I looked at my father for a long moment. I looked at the framed family portrait on the sideboard. I looked at my mother's hands, which were gripping the edge of the table just hard enough to turn her knuckles pale. Then I pushed back my chair, walked upstairs, and packed a single bag. Before I left, my father pressed something into my hand in the hallway. It was my grandmother's pendant, a small gold oval with a tiny sapphire chip, the kind of piece that looks modest until you hold it in the light. He said, "Take it. It's worth something, more than you're walking toward." He said it like he was doing me a favor, like he was sending me off with something valuable to remind me of everything I was giving up. I closed my hand around it. I walked out the front door. I heard the deadbolt turn behind me. The first week, I slept on Daniel's couch. The second week, I told him I wouldn't let him take care of me, that I needed to figure this out myself. He understood. He always understood. I moved into a room I rented from a woman named Gloria, who owned a small bookkeeping firm on the edge of downtown Nashville and had zero patience for self-pity. Gloria was 61 years old, drove a truck that was older than me, and could spot a financial discrepancy in a spreadsheet from across the room. She found me sitting on the porch steps one night, staring at nothing, and she did not ask me what was wrong. She handed me a cup of chamomile and sat down next to me and said, "Whatever happened, you're still upright. Upright is everything." She let me work in her office in exchange for rent. She taught me things that no accounting textbook ever covered. She taught me how money hides. She taught me that the numbers people show you and the numbers that are real are almost never the same thing, and that the distance between those two sets of numbers is where power lives. I absorbed everything she gave me. I worked through nights. I finished my degree online, and I stored up the pain of that Sunday dinner the way certain trees store fire, not to be destroyed by it, but to be shaped by it. Daniel and I did get married, quietly, at the courthouse in Davidson County, with Gloria and his mother as witnesses. It was the happiest day of my life, and I spent part of it thinking about the empty chairs where my parents should have been. The years that followed were not a montage. They were slow, grinding, frequently unglamorous work. I started as a junior analyst at a small forensic accounting firm in Nashville. I was meticulous and relentless, and I developed a reputation for finding things that were meant to stay hidden. By the time I was 28, I was being recruited. By 30, I had co-founded Ashline Analytics with 2 partners in Austin, Texas. We specialized in financial forensics fraud detection, litigation support, tracing assets that had been deliberately buried. In a world full of people who were very good at hiding money, I became someone who was very good at finding it. I kept my grandmother's pendant on my desk, not around my neck, just on the desk, where I could see it. A reminder of what it cost. A reminder of who gave it to me and why. My parents and I had no contact. I had become good at not thinking about them. But I never stopped watching. Not out of obsession. More the way a navigator watches a distant storm, not because you're headed toward it, but because you need to know where it is at all times. My father's consulting firm had been quietly struggling for years. I knew this the way I knew most things, through data. Public filings, credit reports, the particular silence of a business that has stopped growing and started contracting. He had made a significant bet on a real estate development partnership in 2019 that went sideways. He had covered the losses badly. He had borrowed against assets he didn't actually control. Then, 2 years ago, my maternal grandfather passed away in Knoxville. I didn't go to the funeral. I heard about it the same way I heard about most things in my family's orbit, indirectly, through a cousin who still had my number. What I didn't know until 4 months ago was what my grandfather had left behind. His name was Walter Brennan, and he had been a quiet, careful man who spent 40 years building a portfolio of industrial properties in eastern Tennessee that were, by the time of his death, worth considerably more than anyone in my family had anticipated. His estate attorney reached out to me through LinkedIn. He told me that my grandfather had amended his will 3 years before his death. He had left 40% of his estate to me directly. The remaining 60% went to my parents, subject to certain conditions that required my signature to execute. My parents didn't know I knew this yet. Or rather, they didn't know how much I knew. I called my attorney, a woman named Priya who had handled my firm's legal work for 6 years and who had the sharpest mind I had ever encountered in a conference room. I told her what I had. I told her I wanted to understand every layer of it before I made a single move. What Priya found over the following weeks was not a simple inheritance dispute. What she found was a blueprint. My father had been in contact with my grandfather's estate attorney for over a year before the death. He had submitted a document notarized, official-looking, detailed, claiming that I had verbally agreed to waive my portion of the inheritance in favor of a family trust controlled by my parents. The document bore what appeared to be my signature. I had never seen it. I had never signed it. I had never been in the same room as the notary whose stamp appeared on the bottom of the page. My father had also taken out a loan against the anticipated value of the inheritance. A significant loan. One that was now coming due. One that my parents could not repay without the full estate distribution, which could not happen without my signature on the actual legal documents. They needed me, and they had spent months laying the groundwork to make sure that when they came to me, they would come with leverage. Priya flagged the forged document to the estate attorney. We said nothing publicly. We copied everything. We built the record carefully and quietly, the way you build any case evidence first, confrontation second. I called Gloria from my office one night when the building was empty. I told her what I had found. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "You know what you have to do." I told her I did. She said, "Then do it right. Don't do it angry. Do it clean." I thought about that pendant on my desk for a long time after I hung up the phone. 3 weeks later, my mother called me for the first time in 19 years. Her voice was careful, practiced, warm in the particular way of someone reading from a script they've rehearsed. She said she had been thinking about me. She said the years had given her perspective. She said my father had been unwell, and that it had made them both reflect on what truly mattered. She said the word family twice in the first 60 seconds. I listened. I let her talk. At the end, I told her I would think about it. She gave me a number to call. I recognized the area code. It wasn't Nashville. They had moved to Austin sometime in the past 3 years. I hadn't known that. I filed it. 2 days later, my father called from the same number. He was warmer than I had ever heard him. He said things he had never said in my childhood, that he respected what I had built, that he had followed my career, that he wanted to make things right. He mentioned my grandfather's estate briefly, casually, the way you mention something you're trying to make seem unimportant. He said they just needed me to look at a few documents. Just a formality. Just paperwork. I told him I would come. I want you to understand what that cost me. Because it was not nothing. 19 years of learning how to live without your parents does not make you immune to the sound of your father's voice turning kind for the first time. It doesn't make you immune to the small bruised part of you that still remembers wanting to be enough for them. I drove home that night and sat in my kitchen for an hour before I trusted myself to move. Then I called Priya. I told her to be ready. I told Daniel that evening. He listened without interrupting, the way he always did. When I finished, he reached across the table and covered my hand with his. He said, "Tell me what you need." I told him I needed him to trust that I had this. He said, "I've trusted you since the courthouse. That's not going to change." My parents came to my building on a Tuesday morning. I watched them on the security monitor. I let them stand there for exactly 3 minutes before I buzzed them up. The elevator doors opened into the foyer of my penthouse, and my parents stepped out and looked around the way people do when a space exceeds their expectations, and they can't quite decide whether to be impressed or resentful. My mother's eyes moved across the room. My father's hands were clasped in front of him, a posture I remembered from negotiations he'd described to me when I was small, the controlled stillness of a man who wants to project calm while calculating rapidly. I offered them coffee. I was not going to drink any. I poured it, set the cups on the table, and sat down across from them. My father looked the same in structure, the same jaw, the same deliberate economy of movement, but the certainty was different. The certainty that had filled every room he'd ever entered had thinned somewhere along the way. He looked like a man playing a role he'd written years ago, and only now noticing the lines didn't quite fit. My mother smiled at me. It was a real smile, I think, or a real performance of one. After 19 years, I was no longer certain I could tell the difference. "You've built something extraordinary here," my father said. He gestured at the apartment, at the city visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "I want you to know that we see that. We see you." I let the silence sit for a moment before I answered. "Thank you for coming," I said. "I know this wasn't easy to arrange." He leaned forward. He told me about my grandfather's estate. He spoke carefully, framing everything as a matter of administrative efficiency, a few documents, a standard process. He placed a folder on the coffee table between us. He said my signature would allow the estate to close cleanly and allow our family to move forward together. My mother reached over and touched the folder. "We've missed so much time," she said softly. "This could be the start of something new, Claire, for all of us." I looked at the folder. I looked at my mother's hand on top of it. I looked at my father's face. "I've missed you too," I said. And I meant it. That was the most complicated part. The anger was always easier to manage than the grief underneath it. I pulled the folder toward me and opened it. I made a show of reading. My father began to explain the documents in that careful, instructive tone I recognized from childhood. The tone that meant he had already decided how things would go. He explained the trust structure. He explained the disbursement timeline. He explained where my signature was required. He did not explain the document he had submitted to the estate attorney, claiming I had already agreed to waive my portion. He did not explain the loan he had taken against the anticipated inheritance. He did not mention Priya. He did not mention that I had already received the complete estate filing from my grandfather's attorney. He did not mention that I had been sitting with a copy of his forged signature document for 11 weeks. I closed the folder. I set it back on the table. "Before I sign anything," I said, keeping my voice even, "I want to make sure I understand the full picture. Can you walk me through the existing claims against the estate?" A pause. Brief. Most people would have missed it. I had spent 15 years reading the small hesitations in financial testimony. The almost invisible gap between a question and a prepared answer versus a question and a real one. "There are no existing claims that would affect your portion," my father said. "What about the Meridian Capital loan?" I asked. "The one issued against projected inheritance disbursement, filed in January of last year." The room changed temperature. My mother's hand went still on her coffee cup. My father's expression did not collapse. I will give him that. He was practiced, but the certainty drained out of his eyes the way water drains from a tub, quietly, steadily, until there's nothing left. "Where did you hear about that?" he said. "Public record," I said. "It's my job." He pivoted. He said the loan was a technical matter, that it had been handled, that it didn't affect anything we were discussing today. He said my grandfather would have wanted the family united. He said the estate was really just a vehicle for rebuilding something that had been lost, and wasn't that worth more than any dollar amount? "Absolutely," I said, "which is why I think it's important to be honest with each other." I opened my laptop. I turned it to face them. On the screen was the document my father had submitted to the estate attorney, the one with my forged signature. My father looked at it. He did not speak. "I've never signed this," I said. "I've never been in the same state as the notary whose stamp is on page 3. Priya has already submitted a full forensic analysis to the estate attorney and a copy to the district attorney's office. The digital metadata on the signature field alone is sufficient for a forgery charge, but the notary has also provided a deposition confirming the signature was not obtained in their presence." My mother made a sound. It was small, like something had been pressed out of her. My father's jaw was tight. He said my name once, in a low voice, in the tone of a man reaching for authority he no longer possessed. "I'm not finished," I said. I turned the laptop back toward me, opened another file, and slid a printed page across the table. It was the loan documentation, the disbursement projections, the signature on the bottom, the one authorizing the use of my anticipated inheritance portion as collateral, also bore my name. Also not mine. "This is a second instance of forged authorization," I said. "Priya has flagged both to the appropriate parties. I want to be clear that I am not presenting this to you to be cruel. I'm presenting it to you because you came to my home today and asked me to sign a document without disclosing that you had already forged my name on 2 others. And I think you deserve to understand what you walked into." My father stood up. He said I was being vindictive. He said I had always been dramatic. He said that if I had simply stayed, if I had simply trusted his judgment, none of this would have been necessary. He said Daniel's name like it was an explanation for everything, like 19 years of my life could be filed under that single variable. I stood up too. I was not angry. I want you to understand that. I had processed the anger in the months before this moment, piece by piece, the way you process evidence methodically, without letting emotion contaminate the record. What I felt standing there was not rage. It was clarity. "Dad," I said. It was the first time I had used that word in 19 years. I said it carefully. I paid for my own education. I built my own firm. I made my own name mean something. I did all of that without $1 from this family, without one phone call, without one moment of acknowledgement from either of you. And then when you needed something, you didn't call to apologize. You called to collect. He started to speak. I continued. "You forged my signature. Twice. That is a federal crime. I have reported it. What happens next is not in my hands." My mother covered her mouth. For the first time, she looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw something in her face that I had been waiting 19 years to see. Not pride, not apology exactly, just recognition. Like she was finally seeing the person standing in front of her, instead of the problem she had been managing. It came about 19 years too late. "You should go," I said. "Your attorney will be in contact with Priya." They left. My father walked ahead. My mother paused at the elevator. She looked back at me. She opened her mouth and closed it again. She stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. I stood in my foyer for a long time. The city hummed outside the windows. Somewhere below, 19 years of silence was still settling. The case moved quickly. My father's attorney attempted a negotiation. Priya declined it. The estate was frozen pending the forgery investigation. 3 months later, my father accepted a plea agreement for wire fraud and document forgery. He received a suspended sentence, a substantial fine, and a 5-year probationary period. The consulting firm he had spent 30 years building was dissolved in the settlement. My mother moved into a small house in Brentwood, Tennessee, close to her sister. She sent me a letter. I read it. I did not respond. Not yet. I received my grandfather's inheritance intact. I put the majority of it into a scholarship fund at Vanderbilt for first-generation college students. I named it for Gloria, who, when I called to tell her, was quiet for a long moment and then said, "That's not necessary," and then after another pause said, "That's very necessary. Thank you." The week after the legal proceedings closed, I drove out to Lake Travis. It was an evening in late October, and the water was very still, and the light was coming down at an angle that made everything look like it had been carefully arranged. I walked to the water's edge and I stood there alone. I reached into my pocket and took out my grandmother's pendant. The small gold oval, the sapphire chip that caught the light. My father had handed it to me like a consolation prize, like a severance package, like the period at the end of a sentence that said you are not worth more than this. I had kept it for 19 years, not to remember him by, to remember myself by, the girl who walked out that door, the girl who took the pendant and left everything else behind and chose a life that was hers. I closed my fingers around it. I felt the small, familiar weight of it, and then I did not throw it into the water. I held it. I thought about my grandmother, who I had loved and who had nothing to do with her son's choices. I thought about how objects hold the memories we assign to them, and how I got to decide what this one meant. I put it back in my pocket. I was going to take it to Gloria. Let her keep it. Let it mean something new. I stood at the water's edge for a while longer, watching the light change. There is a particular kind of freedom that comes not from victory, but from completion, from understanding that you have been in a conversation with the past for years and years, answering a question that should never have been asked of you, and then one day putting down the pen. Not dramatically, not with a speech, just quietly setting it down and turning toward everything that is still ahead. My father told me the night I left that I was making the worst decision of my life. He was wrong. The worst decision would have been staying. I drove home as the last of the light went out over the hills. Daniel was in the kitchen when I got home. He had made dinner. Nothing elaborate, just pasta, and too much garlic, and the good olive oil from the cabinet above the stove. He looked up when I came in and he smiled at me the way he always has, like the years haven't moved through him at all. "How was it?" he asked. "Finished," I said. He nodded. He handed me a glass of wine. He went back to the stove. I sat at the kitchen counter, and I thought about what Gloria had said to me on that porch in Nashville when I was 22 years old, and had nothing. Upright is everything. I was upright. I had been upright the whole time. There is something I want to say to you directly, because I know some of you are carrying a version of this story. Maybe it's a parent. Maybe it's a sibling. Maybe it's someone who was supposed to be your safe place and turned out to be the sharpest edge in the room. I know what it feels like to build a life in the negative space of someone else's rejection, to make every success partly an answer to someone who told you you weren't worth the investment. I'm not going to tell you the anger goes away. Some of it stays. What changes is its address. It moves from the front of you to somewhere further back, and eventually it stops being the first thing you reach for. What I know is this: the door that closed behind me that night in Nashville was not the end of my story. It was the first line of a new one, and the person who wrote the rest of it was me. If you've been standing in the rain while a door clicked shut behind you, keep walking. Not because it stops hurting, but because there is something on the other side that is entirely and irreversibly yours. If this story meant something to you, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it. You are not carrying this alone.